a cue card up.
All right, there you go. I'm going to make Ava the host. All right, good to go.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Election Law. I am Senator Melanie LeVake, and today we'll be having hearings on one bill and one proposed amendment to that bill. Before we get started, I'll read through a checklist to ensure that the meeting that we are holding is in compliance with the right to know. As chair of the Senate Election Law and Municipal Affairs Committee, I find that due to the state of emergency declared by the governor as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in accordance with the governor's emergency order number 12, pursuant to Executive Order 2020-04 and its extensions, this public body is authorized to meet electronically. Please note that there is no physical location to observe and listen contemporaneously to this meeting, which was authorized pursuant to the governor's emergency order. In accordance with the emergency order, I am confirming that we are providing public access to the meeting by telephone with remote access, possibly by video and other electronic means. We are using Zoom webinar for this electronic meeting. All members of the committee and selected legislative staff have the ability to communicate contemporaneously in this meeting through this platform. And the public has access to contemporaneously watch and or listen to the meeting on Zoom and YouTube and via phone by following the directions and links provided on the General Court website. We have provided public notice of the necessary information for accessing the meeting in the Senate calendar. We are providing a mechanism for the public to alert the public body during the meeting if there are problems with access. If anyone has a problem, please call 603-271-3043 or write to Ava.
Remote Senate at leg.state.nh.us.
Thank you. In the event the public is unable to access the meeting, will be adjourned and rescheduled. Please note that all votes taken during this meeting shall be done by roll call vote. Finally, let's start the meeting by taking a roll call attendance. When each member states their presence, please also state where you are and if anyone else is in the room with you during this meeting, which is required under the right to know. Senator Regina Birdsell. You're on mute.
I'm here. I'm in my kitchen, alone at the moment.
Thank you. Senator James Gray.
I'm at my home in Rochester and I'm alone.
Thank you. Senator John Morgan.
I am at my home in Brentwood and I am alone at the moment.
Senator Tom Sherman.
I'm at my home in Rye and I am alone in this room, but there are family members and workmen in the house.
Thank you. And Senator Melanie LeVake, I am alone in this room and my daughter is in the other room working. So I'm virtually alone. Thank you very much. Before we start today, we'd like to begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you could stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd also like to take 30 seconds. Well, let's make that 15 seconds to recognize the recent murder of George Floyd and the unrest in our country, and pray that we'll all come together and resolve these issues. Thank you, and let's get started. Okay. The senator recognizes prime sponsor for HB 1672, Representative Rogers. Welcome, Representative Rogers.
Can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
Okay. I'm gonna have to pull up my testimony here. Excuse me. Madam Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Catherine Rogers and I represent Merrimack District 28 in Concord. House Bill 1672, as passed by the House, would allow any voter who's qualified to vote at any state election by means of an absentee ballot, otherwise known as a no excuse absentee voting. Just what does it do for the people of New Hampshire? It would provide an alternative for voters and enable them to participate more fully in the process. It would allow eligible voters to cast their ballot before Election Day without an excuse. These methods give voters viable alternatives to Election Day voting, enabling them to cast their vote and become active citizens. Under current law, only voters who have an excuse may obtain an absentee ballot. Without an excuse, voters aren't able to obtain absentee ballots and cannot vote early, forcing them to either vote on Election Day or choose not to vote. Without the option of no excuse absentee voting, countless voters aren't able to have their votes heard, or they're forced to just lie. Census reports from the 2012 presidential election, revealed that a majority of non-voters were too busy to make it to the polls. No excuse absentee voting would allow those eligible voters who are unable to make it to the polls on Election Day due to work, family, or transportation difficulties to become part of the electorate. This year, we add to that fear of exposure to the COVID-19 virus or the fact that they're suffering from that virus. In 2018 presidential election, 34 votes plus the District of Columbia offered some form of early or no excuse absentee voting. More than 50% of votes in these states favor those methods. In the 2012 presidential election, nearly 25% of all ballots cast were early voting or absentee. Providing voters with flexible alternatives to casting their votes widens the base of participation and fosters a democratic environment in which people can exercise their right to vote and make important decisions. Absentee vote ballots already allow voters with an excuse like travel or sickness, or in the past we added on people that are providers, healthcare providers, childcare providers, and so forth, to use a mail-in ballot. But why should voters always need an excuse to cast an absentee ballot? A policy of no excuse absentee allows anybody to request the ballot for any reason, to save time, avoid lines, work around a busy work or childcare schedule, anything. 30 states already provide it to any voter that requests one. In states like Oregon and Washington, it's the only way they vote. The downside to no excuse absentee ballots is that voters don't enjoy the zone of privacy of the ballot box. And when voting at home, it's possible for spouses, relatives, or others to look over a voter's shoulder while voting and make sure they do the right thing, as they say. Voting too early before an election also makes it possible that voters don't have the full information that comes with a campaign. Some people mention fraud. Nationwide, in 2012 presidential election, there were only 7 documented cases of absentee voting fraud. Since Oregon went to all mail voting in 2000, only 33 cases of alleged voter fraud, or around 0.0005% fraud. The chance of voter suppression is far greater, actually, than the chance of voter fraud. We all know how it works. It's the same way that voter absentee voter works now. It's conducted by mail-in ballot prior to the day of the election. Nothing changes. It's just what the excuse is. Many states help facilitate the process by making absentee ballots available online for voters to print and send. 5 states, Florida, Louisiana, Maryland, Minnesota, and Utah, permit a voter to submit an absentee ballot entirely online. Arizona has some counties that have the absentee process take place altogether online and on your smartphone. While some states offer a version of absentee voting that's quite a lot like ours. The type and what it does varies state by state, allowing anything to happen. Well, this year, our Secretary of State has changed his interpretation of the definition of disability to allow for the fear of COVID-19 virus so that people can more easily vote. I know there's an amendment that's being offered that will put that into the statute, and that's a good thing. The amendment offered today is a small step in the right direction. And while I'd prefer that you pass the bill in its original form, I'm a realist. I understand that we have to take small steps to make things happen. And as they say, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with this one small step. So I believe it's time for New Hampshire to move into the 21st century and allow our residents to increase their already high participation rate in elections. Busy schedules, the mobility of our citizens is in the interest of our government demand that we move forward in making voting more accessible. No excuse absentee voting is the ideal in my mind, but this is a step and I'm willing to take one step. As I said, I'm a realist. So I hope that you will pass the amendment. If something happens and the spirit moves you and you want to go with the original bill, I would be ecstatic. But I really hope that you'll pass this amendment. I'm a little concerned with the wording, but I think you'll work it out. I have a great deal of trust in your chairwoman that she knows how to do the right thing. And all of you on the committee, you've shown your commitment before to the accessibility of voting, and I hope you'll do so again. I'm happy to answer any questions if I can. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Representative Rogers. Does anyone on the committee have any questions of Representative Rogers? I could just go like this.
And I'll be glad to submit the testimony in writing with the forms that you have. So,
Okay, thank you very much. And seeing no questions, we can open it up to the people in the gallery.
Perfect. The next person I have signed up to speak is Representative Bergeron. It appears Representative Bergeron. Oh, you're unmuted.
Okay.
Welcome,
you.
Representative Bergeron. And today, right now, we're speaking strictly on the House Bill 1672.
Thank you, Senator. And actually, I think Representative Rogers said everything I would have said on the bill itself. So I won't take up any of the committee's time, but I would like to address the amendment when we come to that part of the agenda.
Okay. Does anyone have questions of Representative Bergeron? I do. Representative Bergeron, as a city clerk for Nashua, can you tell me how this would impact voting for a city like Nashua?
I think it's hard to predict because it's territory we haven't really explored yet. It's not unusual for absentee ballots to comprise about 5 to 10% of the total ballots cast. If we open it up to the reasons why people can cast votes by absentee ballot, that number will go up significantly. Under normal times, it might go up to 20 or 25%. I think because of the COVID-19 situation we're in today, talking to the Nashua City Clerk, she thinks it could be as much as 50%, but it's really hard to predict. The numbers are going to be numbers we've never seen before, I think.
And aside from COVID, do you see a sharp increase if it wasn't COVID and we were doing no excuse?
I want to call it statistically, it would be a sharp increase. Maybe we go from 8% to 20%. Maybe instead of 500 or 600 absentee ballots being processed in each of the wards, it might go up to 1,000. So there's going to be more of a burden on the election officials to get these ballots processed on election day. But at the same time, that cuts down on the lines on election day. You're going to have that number of voters not standing in line, not registering to vote, or opening up the process at the polling places a little bit.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Does anyone else have questions? Seeing none. Thank you again, Representative Bergeron.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Sherman.
I just received an email from the Deputy Secretary of State that he was having trouble getting in.
Okay.
I think Ava also got that.
I'm on it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Should we wait?
No, you're good to go.
We're good? Okay. All right.
Next signed up to speak is Kyrie Claflin. Should be all set.
Welcome, Ms. Claflin.
Looks like they're muted on their end.
Am I
There we
unmuted now?
There we go.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Carrie Claflin, and I'm a supervisor of the checklist in Concord. Having this office is a pleasure and an honor, but I'm also over 60 and I have an underlying respiratory condition. Now, I don't think of showing up on election day to do my job as optional, but I'm worried and my family is worried for me. Poll workers in other states have become infected with COVID because of their exposure to infected people on their primary day over the last 3 months. There have been news reports from Illinois, Wisconsin, and Florida that I'm aware of. Perhaps there are others. Most disturbing is that one poll worker in Illinois died from COVID after being infected, presumably at the polls. Election officials spend all day and most of the evening with each other in an enclosed space, potentially without good ventilation. But supervisors have the most prolonged contact with voters on election day. We register voters, or as we register voters, we sit across from each other, we talk about the information we need to get from them, we pass documents back and forth. When it's busy, voters stand around the front and side of the supervisor's table. If it gets busy, social distancing will be interesting. So I want to use this opportunity to stress how important it is to me and others in my position that this committee do everything you possibly can to facilitate efforts, including legislation, that make it safe, secure, and convenient for voters to register and vote absentee this fall. I don't want anybody coming to the polls who is able to register or vote from home. It's the safest thing for all of us. Thank you for hearing my testimony.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Ms. Claflin? Nope, seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Henry Clementowitz.
Yes, welcome, Henry Clementowitz. How are you?
I'm well, thank you,
Good.
Madam Chair and members
Okay.
of the committee. I am testifying on behalf of the ACLU of New Hampshire, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting civil liberties throughout the state. I've provided written testimony to the committee, so I'll keep this brief, but there have been a number of steps that the ACLU of New Hampshire has suggested taking in order to protect our elections during the coronavirus pandemic, including making sure that absentee ballots can be at least partially processed ahead of time, including making sure that postage is included for return envelopes for absentee ballots. We commend the Secretary of State and Attorney General for issuing the formal guidance that they have, both for on absentee voting back in April and on the registration that came out today. But I think testimony that's been elicited at the Secretary of State's Select Committee has made clear that there's still work to be done to make sure that the process runs smoothly. And there are elements in this bill with its amendment that we think do exactly that. So thank you. Thank you. And that concludes my prepared remarks.
Thank you very much.
Questions?
Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have signed up to speak is Joseph Bagshaw. However, I don't see him under the attendees list. So if he is calling in via phone, please feel free to press *9 and that'll virtually raise your hand. In the meantime, while we sort that out, Olivia Zink is signed up to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Zink, and welcome.
Good afternoon, and members of the committee. My name is Olivia Zink, and I live in Franklin, New Hampshire, and I serve as the Executive Director for Open Democracy Action, a nonpartisan organization founded by Granny D. Doris Haddock, and we have about 35,000 supporters in New Hampshire. And I want to speak to the bill as no excuse absentee, but I'll do that by sharing a quick story. My father is 78 years old and in a wheelchair and has very severe mobility issues and has refused to vote absentee using the disability clause because he feels that it would be unfair to mark disability when he is not fully disabled. And so for residents like my father who really should be voting from home due to their mobility, but to anyone else who's fearful of COVID-19, having a no excuse ability to vote absentee is really important. I'm very concerned that many will not want to mark disability and sign under penalty of perjury under the COVID, even though they can due to the guidance. I have a lot of additional comments about the amendment. Should I hold those for now?
If you don't mind, if you could hold them, that would be great. So are there any questions for Ms. Zink? Seeing none, thank you very much, and we'll talk with you shortly.
Next up to speak is Victoria Turner.
Hello, Ms. Turner, welcome.
Thank you. My name is Victoria Turner. I am speaking on the bill now, but I have some other comments on the amendment that I'll hold for later. I'm a supervisor of the checklist in the town of Bennington, New Hampshire, and I've been a supervisor of the checklist since 1994. And I've seen a lot of changes in that time. I believe I was working for the first election that we had same day registration. And I was also heavily involved in transitioning over to the statewide checklist, which we call ElectionNet. When I first became a supervisor, we had a paper checklist. And so every time we updated it, we had to type a new one. So we've come a long way in the way of technology. And through those changes, I've seen that people are sometimes reluctant to adopt new technologies. They're afraid that they're not going to work as well or be as secure or allow us to have control over the process. But what I've seen is that the Secretary of State has always done a very good job of making sure that when we adopt these new technologies, that everybody is well educated and that we maintain, the principles and standards that we've always held to in New Hampshire for having free and fair elections and well-managed elections and good voter turnout. So I have faith that if we adopt new technologies now, that we'll have that same success. And I'll hold the rest of my comments for the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Turner? I do have a question. As far as no excuse absentee ballots, do you think that it would increase voter participation? Do you think it would reduce voting at the polls? What kind of effect do you think it would have?
I think that having no excuse absentee balloting is probably, the number one thing that we can do to divert people from voting in person. And given, I am fully behind what Carrie Claflin said about being concerned about being at the polls, and the fewer people we have, the better off we're going to be from a health standpoint, from protecting both the voters and from the poll workers. And in other states that have no excuse absentee balloting, the statistics bear out the fact that it increases the number of people who participate in that system. The math is there.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, and seeing no further questions, we'll go to the next person.
Okay, so next I have Deputy Secretary of State David Scanlon.
Welcome, Deputy Scanlon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm more interested in testifying on the amendment to this bill, but I will say that our past position on no excuse absentee voting is that the office believes that there should be an excuse required to request an absentee ballot, especially in light of the fact that to do anything other than that would require security measures to be taken, which are not currently in place. In fact, there is no, due to a court ruling, there is no requirement now that signatures have to match between the affidavit envelope on an absentee ballot and the application, the signature on the application request. We believe that's problematic, and so I'm just reiterating the position that we've held on this type of legislation in the past. Like I said, I will be speaking later on when you get onto the amendment. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Deputy Scanlon? Okay, I do have a question. You talked about security measures. What specifically are the security measures that are of concern?
The concern, first of all, is that that there is, there's no good measure now to try and determine whether an absentee ballot coming in is actually from the person that requested it, because we cannot match signatures. Most other states are still able to do that, and to the extent that you begin to open up absentee ballot procedures and processes to make it too easy, it opens the door for ballot harvesting, which we have seen happen in other places. It gives candidates, political parties, campaigns a greater opportunity to manage the absentee ballot voting process because it is done outside of the polling place. And those are all concerns that we have that we believe need to be addressed before you implement relaxing the absentee voting requirements.
And can I ask, are there any documented cases of what you're talking about that have happened in the past, say, 5 years?
I can get that information for you. I believe Georgia had, one of the southern states, if it wasn't Georgia, it was South Carolina, had an issue with ballot harvesting issues. But I will compile that for you.
Okay, thank you. And are there any other questions?
This is Senator Gray.
Yes, Senator Gray.
You asked the question of previous witnesses about any evidence or their thoughts about whether this would increase voter turnout, etc. I'll let you phrase the question so that it's similar, but I would like Deputy Scanlon to respond to
that. Thank you, Madam Chair. There is no evidence that we see that shows that making it easier to vote by absentee or vote by mail increases voter turnout. In fact, evidence shows that the opposite may be true. A good example of that is the state of Oregon, who prior to going to a vote by mail system was consistently higher in voter turnout than the state of New Hampshire was. And after that, after they adopted vote by mail, which is different than no excuse absentee voting, but similar, New Hampshire's position in voter turnout on a percentage basis has continued to increase over Oregon's, which seems to continue to drop.
And it would seem to me that it is each individual's responsibility and right to vote. So whether they do it by mail or whether they go to the polls, I would think that our responsibility is facilitating that act. Wouldn't you think? I would say that. I'm trying to turn it into a question.
I think that, I think that you would say that. I think that's everybody's goal in this process is to make sure that everybody has a right to vote and a convenient way to exercise that right.
Mhm. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Deputy Scanlon, and we'll talk with you shortly.
Okay, next we have to speak is Louise Spencer.
Welcome, Ms. Spencer.
Hi, thank you for having me, Madam Chair. I also was primarily going to speak to the amendment, but I would just say that in general, I support the concept of no excuse absentee voting. And I do believe actually that voter turnout in Oregon was dramatically increased this last election cycle. And I think that we do need to carefully look at the statistics and the evidence around what happens when we move to a mail-in or a no excuse voter absentee position. My understanding is that it actually does result in higher voter participation, but I think it would be good to get the data on that specifically.
So it sounds like we should be looking at over a period of time, not just a point in time, but over a longer period to see some trends.
Yes, and also the way the different states have gone about implementing it. So I think there's a lot to look at before we draw any conclusions. And I think ballot harvesting is also something that is very rare if it happens at all. So,
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Spencer? Got a quiet bunch today. Thank you very much.
All right, next we have Joseph Bagshaw.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you briefly. I wanted to address the question of absentee balloting with a particular specific example. My wife has severe emphysema. She is on oxygen 24/7. For her to vote in person would be, first of all, very exhausting, and secondly, in the time of this pandemic, extremely hazardous. Were she to contract COVID-19, given her condition, it's almost certain it would be fatal. For myself, although I have no physical limitations, were I to bring home inadvertently the virus and infect my wife, you can imagine the outcome. It is not a risk that I am willing to take, and thus I am sequestered just as much as my wife. Moreover, I am her sole caregiver. So collectively, we cannot risk infection of either of us, not in the slightest. Therefore, absentee voting for us is an absolute must. Fortunately, this year, we are able to do so without a problem, because the Secretary of State has decided that COVID avoidance is a legitimate reason for obtaining an absentee ballot. But what about future years? For us, seasonal flu could be almost as life-threatening as COVID-19. So I would urge that no excuse absentee balloting should become an accepted way to cast one's ballot. And I would like to also, just in closing, point out that the Constitution of the United States guarantees every citizen the right to vote, but it places no constraints on the manner of voting. And so I think that it is entirely consistent with the intent and the spirit of our Constitution to allow every citizen the freedom to choose his or her manner of voting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bagshaw. And you brought up some very good points. Are there any questions of Mr. Bagshaw?
Senator Gray.
Senator Gray?
Yes, I'd like to know if Mr. Bagshaw, you said, was
Bagshaw?
aware that state law right now talks about infirm people and care of the infirmed as legitimate reasons for absentee ballots.
Mr. Bagshaw?
It was my impression that this was sort of a special dispensation for 2020. The persons who are genuinely disabled, yes, I understood that. But the caregivers for those persons, no, I was not aware that they are also entitled to an absentee ballot. Nevertheless, I stand by my suggestion that this should be a choice that every citizen has the right to make.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Okay. Seeing none, thank you for your testimony, Mr. Bagshaw.
Well, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
So next on our list signed up to speak is Tristan Bills. However, I don't see them listed. So if you are calling in via phone, please dial *9 and that'll virtually raise your hand. Tristan is the last person I have to speak to the bill. So they are also signed up to speak to the amendment. So
And we don't, okay. We don't see anybody yet.
we don't. So that's all we have for folks signed up to speak to the bill.
Okay. Okay, very good. Okay, in that case, I'd like to close the hearing on House Bill 1672, seeing no further questions. And I'd like to open the hearing on the amendment 1281S and introduce the amendment. Let's see. Okay. Okay. I'd like to introduce the amendment. The title of the bill is an act relative to absentee voting. It is has been added to 1672. We have talked about 1672, which is absentee voting, and that's the beginning of the amendment. Okay. We also have on page 8, let's see, want to make sure I have the right part. Yes, on page 8, line 7, we have added HB 556, which is partial processing of absentee ballots prior to an election. And this is something that moderators, especially from larger cities, have been asking for, the ability to start the processing early, not looking at the ballots, but preparing the ballots for counting and doing that early, anticipating that we'll get a large amount of ballots with this election especially, but even before that, this is something that was asked for. And I do recall that the Secretary of State had a level of support for this as well. I've also heard conversations of this in our select election committee. So this bill would allow towns and cities to start processing early. There have been some changes I'd like to highlight in this amendment on page 8, line 11. It states that, I'm going to start with line 10. Such notice shall be posted in 2 appropriate places one of which shall be the public body's internet website, if such exists. So we changed, I believe it was may to shall. That's important in being consistent with our notification. In addition, on line 13, a copy of the notice shall be provided to the Secretary of State. The partial processing of absentee ballots prior to an election shall occur on Thursday or Friday prior to the date of the election. So the notice given to the Secretary of State is important because the Secretary of State can then put it on the website, and therefore it would be available to everyone by accessing the website. The second part regarding the partial processing of absentee ballots to occur Thursday or Friday prior to the date of the election is also for notice, so that people know that it's one of those 2 days that they can come and witness this process. The next change starts on 15 and goes to 16. The moderator shall be assisted by at least 3 other election officials as defined under RSA 652:14. No more, and this is what's added, no more than 2 of whom shall be members of the same party. So that's another change. And then the last one is on line 26, talking about the preparation of site for processing absentee ballots prior to the election. Line 26, to the extent practicable, partial processing of absentee ballots shall occur at the polling location. So those are the changes that have been made to this bill, to HB 556 and this amendment. I also wanted to point out, as we on page 9, line 20, we're talking about online voter registration. We changed the start date to begin August 1st, 2020, which would allow us to possibly make changes that could be incorporated for this election or in preparation of the next. I also would like to add that I had done some research on the cost of doing some small modifications to our ElectionNet system that would allow us to register via portal and also to request absentee ballots. And I found that for a minimum cost for about $350,000, we could actually incorporate a module to our system, which would make it more easy and efficient for people to both register and request an absentee ballot. This will give us the ability to choose to move in this direction if the Secretary of State is ready to do so. And then finally, we have incorporated on page 11, line 18. So once again, we have this amendment regarding entering the Electronic Registration Information Center, ERIC. So the changes that we have requested are what I believe changes that would help us to move through a time like this, a time that we're in COVID, to have the ability to change addresses or to register online would help our citizens to access voting much easier, as well as using a tool like ERIC would also help to recognize voters that weren't registered, as well as to make sure that our voter rolls are clean. So those are the amendments that have been added to this bill. And I'm going to open it up to any questions.
Okay, so first we have Representative Rogers.
Okay, so Representative Rogers would like to speak.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Representative Rogers.
Just briefly, as I said in my statements on the other bill, I prefer the original, but as I said, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with few steps. So I would support the amendment as a start. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Representative Rogers? Okay,
Yep.
Seeing
Thank
none.
you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Representative Bergeron.
Hello again, Representative Bergeron.
Good afternoon. Hello
Good
again.
afternoon. Good afternoon.
I wanted to just focus in on the changes that were made to House Bill 556 relative to allowing municipalities to process absentee ballots prior to Election Day, and specifically page 8 of the amendment, lines 15 through 27. There are three things I'd ask the committee to consider. The first one, where on line 14 it states the partial processing of absentee ballots prior to an election shall occur on the Thursday or Friday prior to the date of the election. I would ask if the committee could also consider adding Saturday to that, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And the reason for that request is twofold. Admittedly, the average age of our poll workers is over 60, but many of them do have full-time jobs. And they're already going to be taking time off on Tuesday for the election, perhaps even Monday afternoon to set up the polling place. If we give them the opportunity to do the processing on Saturday, perhaps they won't have to ask for time off from their employer. And so my request is in part to out of consideration for the election workers. But also the amendment states that as much as possible, the election officials should try and process the absentee ballots at the polling locations. All of Nashua's polling locations are in schools, and I'm sure that's true throughout the state. And for reasons of building security and student safety, a lot of school districts don't hold school in session whenever there's an election being held. And now we might be creating a situation where we're asking the public and election officials to go into a school building when classes are in session. I think the school districts would be a little more amenable to allowing this to occur on a Saturday than they would on a Thursday or Friday. And so that's my reason. If the goal is to have this done at the polling places, then I would ask the committee to consider opening it up for Saturday if possible. Next issue is lines 15 and 16, where it states that the moderator shall be assisted by at least 3 other election officers, no more than 2 of whom shall be members of the same party, which means that we're limiting the number of people that can participate in the process probably to 3 or 4 people. And that might be fine if there's only a few hundred absentee ballots. But if we're talking about hundreds, possibly thousands, in some of the larger communities, they can use more people than just 3 or 4. So the amendment I am suggesting, and I did submit this earlier this morning, I don't know if the committee received it, but phrasing it something like representatives of each of the 2 political parties which received the largest number of votes cast for governor at the last previous general election shall assist during this process, but neither party shall exceed the other party's representation by more than 1 participant. Any number of election officials who are registered as undeclared voters may be appointed by the moderator to assist in the process. And so then if we do have a high number of absentee ballots that have to be processed, the moderator will be able to enlist enough staff to make sure it happens. But by changing that language, we're still trying to ensure that the parties have equal representation during the process. And then the third amendment I might suggest occurs around line 26 on page 8, where it says, to the extent practicable, partial processing of absentee ballots shall occur at the polling location. I'd like to see some language there that says, okay, what do we do if it's not practical? And so what I suggested is something to the effect, if it is not practicable to partially process absentee ballots at the polling locations, the clerk shall provide notice in accordance with RSA 659-55 that the partial processing of absentee ballots will occur at town hall, city hall, or some other location within the municipality. And I'm mentioning specifically town hall or city hall because those are locations that the public would be familiar with. And I know that in Nashua, and I believe at least in one ward in Manchester, there aren't a lot of locations that could actually be used other than the schools if you need to find another location. So those are the three sections of this portion of the amendment I would ask the committee to consider. And I won't go into further details about the original language of 556. The committee addressed that quite well during its earlier public hearing on the matter.
Thank you very much, Representative Bergeron. Senator Sherman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Bergeron, you tweaked one of my few brain cells. And that sentence in line 15 on page 8, the moderator shall be assisted by at least 3 other election officers as defined under RSA, no more than 2 of whom shall be members of the same party. When I read that, I get the sense that the moderator can have really as many as they want, but it has to be at least 3. But if they were to have 10, only 4 could be from parties.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted it. Yes.
So I think no matter what, that is problematic. I was unable to write fast enough to get your wording, but I agree with you that that sentence, no matter what, I think that sentence is going to need a committee amendment to reflect the intention or the intention of the legislature. I didn't pick that up earlier, so thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Senator Gray.
Senator Gray?
Current state law allows the moderator to start opening the envelopes prior to the time, either in the RSA or the 2 hours after. Is that correct?
Yes, they can actually open the outer envelope prior to the 2 hours when they can start taking the ballots out of the envelopes.
For the question, Madam Chair?
Yes, please, go ahead.
If we open that statute up such that the outer envelope could be opened at any time after the receipt of the ballot, the inner envelope would have to remain sealed and in the outer envelope. And that ElectionNet software could be updated to, well, I believe it already does recognize the request for an absentee ballot and the return of an absentee ballot, and the checklist modified to have a column that would say AD or something. Couldn't we do this process right there, election day, and at the polls open at 8, then at 10 o'clock, all the ones with AVs that there are no challenges for be marked by the ballot clerks, and everything would be all done, and except for those that ballots that were returned after a particular time when the checklist was printed.
The ElectionNet is updated by the city or town clerk when the absentee ballot is returned by the voter. He or she will go into the ElectionNet and record the date on which the ballot was received. If you're suggesting that the town or city clerk could open these ballots, I'm not sure if that's what you're suggesting. My experience, having served as city clerk in Nashua, we got so much to do as it is. Asking the clerks to open up hundreds or thousands of absentee ballots, it's time consuming. And that's one reason it really should be managed by the election officials in each voting district in each ward. And I believe, Senator, you've worked as a moderator before, as an election official. I've noticed that there's 2 bottlenecks when we're trying to process absentee ballots. The first one occurs when you're trying to get all the names checked off on the checklist. And that's either going to slow down the people trying to obtain a ballot in person because you have to stop handing out the ballots while the checklist workers are checking off the names being announced by the moderator. And so one of the goals of this legislation was to get the checklists all marked up before the polls even open, thereby relieving the checklist workers of that task and getting rid of that bottleneck that occurs at the polling place on election day. So I don't know if I answered your question directly, but
Further question, Madam Chair?
Yes, another question.
In doing the process as you've defined it, doesn't it preclude an individual who has decided that what they put onto their original absentee ballot is so wrong that they want to do extraordinary things like show up in those 2 hours at the beginning of the election and able to cast the ballot, therefore nullifying their absentee ballot? Doesn't your process preclude all that? And if you chose to vote by absentee 2 weeks ahead of time, you no longer have any ability at all to nullify that ballot and cast one in person.
the way the bill is written currently, yes, that's correct.
Further question, Madam Chair?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Doesn't your bill or amendment, the way it is written, also require anyone who wants to be a challenger for those absentee votes to not only be there for the entire election day election, but also on any of these periods that you're talking about in processing those votes?
Yes, of course. We made sure that there's language in the bill that allows them to do that so that they can be present. You know, as a practical matter, your challengers are usually representatives of candidates or parties that are maintaining their own checklists to identify who has cast a ballot and who has not, so that then they can return that information to party headquarters or campaign headquarters and get on the phones to make sure that their identified supporters will turn out to the polls. In some ways, if this is done on the Thursday, Friday, or Saturday before an election, it might actually benefit the campaigns of the political parties because now they've got some of that information in advance of election day and may be able to put that information to some use. So is it inconvenient? Yes, but I also think it can be very helpful to the parties and the campaigns.
Madam Chair, for the question?
Yes, Senator Gray.
I think that in your response that you were confusing someone who is a poll checker and someone who is challenging an individual on their right to vote. Because could you inform us of the difference between the two?
Well, they both go by the same name, challenger. You know, the political parties will appoint challengers, and what they're actually doing, they're not there to, maybe by law, they have the right to challenge a person's right to vote. However, what they're really doing is keeping a record of who's asking for ballots and who's not. I can only remember one instance where we had a lot of problems with political party challengers being at the polling place, and we were doing same day voter registration. Anybody that registered to vote was being challenged as they approached the checklist. The law has since been changed to kind of prevent that from happening. But yeah, so I mean, they may be doing the task of a poll watcher, but by law, they're called a challenger.
Are there other questions? Representative Bergeron, you brought up some very good points, and we can entertain a committee amendment. So what I'd like you to do is walk through this with us once again, and we want to make sure that everybody has a copy of your suggestions. And can I ask Tricia, do you have copies, and does everybody have copies of the amendment?
I can send them to you all right now.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Because you have made some very good points. Excuse me.
So is the language that I submitted earlier today being forwarded to the committee members? Yes, thank you.
Yes, that's what we're looking at, the amendment.
It should all be in your email boxes right now, personal and legislative, I believe.
Alan, did you send me as well? Thank you.
Document attached. It's a zip file and nothing code shows up.
Mine did open up.
ODT. So
I just sent it over in the body of an email to you guys, so you should the actual text now. Let me know if.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, are we going to have anyone else testify?
Ava, who do we have? Quite a few people?
My apologies. I was letting us sort out getting that document shared. We do have a list of others that are wanting to, that have signed up to speak. Is this the best time to move forward? I just didn't want to interrupt this process.
Yeah, at this time, I just want to make sure everybody has the committee amendment language or potential language. So in an effort to, I have a copy of it. And I think it's pretty clearly marked.
Senator LeVey,
Yes.
I can also try to share it in the chat so that members of the public can see it
Oh,
too.
yes, that would be,
Would you
that
like
would
me
be
to do
very
that?
good.
Okay.
Yeah, and we don't have to talk about it right now because this is more probably exec session stuff. We want to give other people an opportunity to testify. So I just want to make sure everybody has it. And Representative Bergeron, it is very clearly marked, so we can address this when we get to exec session.
thank you.
So thank you very much. Just make sure everybody has a copy of this. Let's see.
Super. So next we have, again, Deputy Secretary of State David Scanlon. However, I will note a Pete, and I apologize if I mispronounce your last name, Basilier has had his hand raised for quite some time. So that's the order, and then we have the remainder of the list. So let me just, okay, you should be able to speak now.
Okay.
Welcome.
Madam Chair,
Thank
this
you,
is
Scanlon.
Dave Scanlon.
Hi.
So if you're ready, I'll just give my brief testimony.
Sure.
So I just wanted to communicate with the committee our opposition to the proposed amendment for HB 1672, which is labeled an act creating the Coronavirus Election Act of 2020. And when I look at most of the items that are included in that amendment, they are bills that have dealt with policy questions that our office has testified on in the past, and trying to implement them at this point will probably be counterproductive in our efforts to be able to conduct an election this fall. I don't think I have to reiterate very much that dealing with the elections this year is going to be a real challenge. and that our belief at this point is that to the extent that we can keep our processes the same for both election workers and voters, where we don't have to do a lot of training and re-education, is going to be beneficial. Can you hear me? Is going to be beneficial for everyone. We recognize, and through guidance that we've issued along with the Attorney General's office, that absentee voting is going to be done at a much greater level this year, and we have to be prepared for that. The process for us has been underway now for a couple of months. We are very far into our planning and processes. The filing period is taking place right now, and as soon as that's done, it is going to be all hands on deck getting the ballot formats generated so that we can get the absentee ballots out much earlier this year than we have in the past. And we're going to make sure that the local election officials have all the materials that they need to expedite that process for the voting population. But there are tremendous demands on not only our office, but everybody that is working on elections this year, and we recognize that. To put in place some of these other things where, an online voter registration system, for example, to be completed by the beginning of August is simply not realistic. There's a lot that goes into an IT project, and to divert our resources to complete something like that is something that is probably just not feasible. And to the extent that there are textual changes to documents and absentee voting materials at this point, a lot of those envelopes, for example, are already being ordered and are in process. So it would be changing gears at a time when it would be very difficult for that to happen. And then finally, to the extent that changes are made and passed into law and required for the upcoming elections, requires additional training for election officials and public education in terms of the processes needed to vote. And again, it's the same thing. Our resources are limited, and to the extent that we get spread too thin, we'll be crushed under additional requirements. And the last thing we want to see in 2020 is a failed election. We want to make sure that the election that we run this year is up to the New Hampshire standard of being conducted with integrity, fairness, and that when the results are reported, they're reported on time and that they are accurate. With all of that said, I will say that we have been supportive, from a policy perspective of some type of processing of the absentee ballot documents ahead of time. And I think Representative Bergeron's bill has some positive things in it. Be helpful to the moderators, and as a long-term policy, it makes sense. It probably makes sense as a short-term policy, but I think that how we deal with that process in the 2020 election may be different than just a process that is ongoing moving forward for every election. As we all know, the details and impact of the COVID virus on elections is a moving target, and to some extent we have to react to things that are happening at the time, and we have to be flexible in how we deal with this crisis. So I guess I would close just by urging the committee to allow the process for this year, this election cycle, to continue moving forward as it is, allowing us the greatest flexibility to be able to deal with what's going on, and these other items that are related to policy. be implemented at a different time or in a different time frame. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Deputy Scanlon. Does anyone have questions? I know I do, but I'll ask you first. Okay, seeing none at this time. Just a couple things, and I guess this is a would you believe. The amendment regarding online voter registration says beginning August 2020. It doesn't say to be implemented. So whether that's just a conception in your mind, a proposal, a mention to your vendor, that is all beginning. And I'd like to ask Deputy Scanlon, if we had these in place, online voter registration, and people were able to change their address by going onto the internet, any web browser, even on your phone, do you think that would help reduce the number of people that will be at the polls during COVID?
I think that's a question I can't answer. I mean, we just don't know. We don't know what the situation is going to look like in September or November. But what I can say is that you know what is being suggested is a major information technology project. We have a vendor that has a product that is available, but what I can tell you, we are having issues with the current vendor in terms of being able to meet critical deadlines for the other IT projects that we have going in the past. The reason for that is that within the last year, the ownership of that company has changed twice, and we heard last week that the entire executive leadership of that company has changed. And I know that you spoke with a particular individual at the company. He's no longer there. So we're in that regard, we're in a difficult position, and I think that that's why these projects take time. And we have to design the way it looks. We have to get input on the users of that system. We have to put it out for bid. It has to be built. People have to be trained on it, and that is a process that takes a significant amount of time and is not something that should be rushed.
So Deputy Scanlon, if we were to, first of all, I do appreciate all you have to do to prepare for this election, and you are preparing us for that. Again, I want to point out that the beginning date is August 2020, but maybe we should be looking at December. Would you be open to us changing the date?
I think, that certainly that would be better than having a date in there of August. And we've had conversations in the past about online registration. It could be a very useful tool down the road, right, but it should not be forced in this current situation.
Okay. We may have to talk about that as well, because the intent was not to have it ready by August, certainly not. But another question I have for you is, are there other vendors that you're aware of that make the central voter database? Would you be looking to moving to a different vendor?
We are in the process of gauging the status of our IT projects at the moment, giving the current vendor an opportunity to perform and complete their task. But if we're not getting results, then we will be putting that project out to bid, and there are other vendors out there that can do the same type of thing.
So you would consider leaving this vendor and going to a new vendor?
We want to make sure that we maintain a system that functions properly, and we have to take whatever steps we need to take to make sure that happens.
Okay. Thank you very much. Senator Sherman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And hello, Deputy Secretary. It's been at least 2 hours. I just wanted to, first of all, say this is a really simple question. Your office did a phenomenal job of getting the affiliation form after the governor's executive order, getting it up on the website promptly and very easily downloadable. Is that a, and I know from being on the select committee that you've been working with IT consultant, I think is the right term. Is that a different process than this one? So this person couldn't fill in that role because they've seemed to do quite a good job of working on the website and making it more interactive, more easily accessible.
The answer is yes, it's a different process. And so what we were dealing with was a standalone form that we could do in a PDF fillable format. So that's readily available software. If we're talking about an online voter registration system where we're trying to make it as convenient as possible for the town clerks and the supervisors of the checklist, that would be it would require computer programming to build a system that would allow the information to go into ElectionNet, pre-populate fields in the database, which is a secure environment, and then shoot that information to the clerk and supervisors of the checklist, which could actually save them time because they would not have to lift information from the form, the fillable PDF document that you just described. That information still has to be transmitted into the database. It would save the clerk that type of work, and instead would simply allow them to receive the information, print a label from ElectionNet, and get their mailing right out. So that's primarily the difference. One is a standalone system versus going through our state database to pre-populate the information in the database and help the clerk.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there other questions? No, seeing none. Thank you very much, Deputy Scanlon.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And
Okay.
there was someone with their hand up.
Yes, Pete, again, I apologize, Basselier. You should be unmuted.
Welcome, Mr. Basselier.
Yes, Madam Chair, it is a French surname, and Ms. Hawks, I appreciate it. You pronounced it very well. Thank you.
Yes.
My name I am the town moderator in Milford. We have 12,000 registered voters. I've been the moderator now for 12 going on 14 years. And I'm testifying that I'm in favor of moving the absentee voting process up to the Thursday, Friday, or perhaps as Representative Bergeron suggested on Saturday. Given the volume of absentee ballots that we anticipate in September and again in November, it seems to me that we need to enable the processing to occur with a minimal disruption to a polling place that will already be significantly disrupted by the fact that we have to change layouts in order to accommodate social distancing. So I think that it becomes critically important that we process up to the point of not opening the inner ballot envelope. So that once the processing is done Thursday, Friday, perhaps Saturday, all the ballots and envelopes go into the vault for the weekend, and then they're brought out on Tuesday morning and brought to the polls, at which point the inner envelope, which holds the ballot, is opened and put into the machine. Bear in mind too, that as a practical matter, when ballots are oversized, anything beyond 8.5 by 11, and that happens frequently at state elections, and it happens well, it can happen all the time at town elections, that ballots that are folded into envelopes and then refolded by the recipient back into an envelope do not feed well through the machine. So it's not only, as was pointed out earlier, a problem for actually marking the ballots on election day when in the traditional process, but it also is a problem for the machines, and it slows down the counting process, which in turn can back up the line, which in turn means in a time when we have 6 feet between voters, it could be a long line. In Milford, we are one of 2, if not 3, communities awards that are actually testing e-poll books. Yeah. So my request of the committee is that as you consider absentee voting and no excuse voting, and you consider moving up the processing start time to the prior week, I ask that you include language that makes it very clear that it also applies to the process applies to e-poll books. I think what many communities are going to find after the November election is that they're going to wish they had e-poll books. They're not familiar with the process. It means first voter in is the first one to the checklist. We don't have long lines by letter of the alphabet. And that complicates the situation for communities without e-poll books in September and again in November of 2020. But for us in Milford, we can still have one line of voters that then disperses across 6 to 8 different e-poll books, whichever one is open first. So I ask that one, you strongly consider it and implement it, including your legislation, absentee processing up to the point of opening the envelope, holding the ballot on Thursday, Friday, or perhaps Saturday the week before. And also that the language be very clear that it applies to e-poll books, which, as you may know or can infer, doesn't require physical marking of a checklist. And with that, Madam Chair, I'm happy to take any questions you may have or any of your committee.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions? No, seeing none. Thank you again. We value your experience, and thank you for being a moderator.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, the next person signed up to speak is Kyrie Claflin.
Hello again, Ms. Claflin.
Seems that they're muted on their end.
Am I unmuted now?
Here we go.
Thank you. Actually, I'm not speaking specifically on the amendment. I spoke earlier, and that still stands.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Next, we have, again, Henry Clementowitz.
Mr. Clementowitz?
Thank you. I was not planning on speaking again, but I thought that I would respond to something I heard about the signature mismatch lawsuit that was mentioned earlier, since that was our case. And I thought I'd just provide a little bit of context for the committee. That was a lawsuit that was brought in federal court by the ACLU and the ACLU of New Hampshire, challenging the process by which untrained election officials discard ballots for having signatures that don't appear to match. And voters were not given an opportunity to cure the signature mismatch, and were not contacted if moderators thought that the signatures didn't match. And so we brought a lawsuit. It was before my time, but we brought a lawsuit on behalf of some voters who had had their ballots thrown away just because the people looking at the signatures didn't think they were the same signature, even though they were in fact signed by the same person. And the federal judge, Judge McCafferty, conducted a balancing analysis where she looked at, how many people's ballots are thrown away versus what are the state interests that are being advanced by the mismatch law. And I thought one part that was particularly striking was the state argued in that case that the signature mismatches were necessary to prevent voter fraud. And the judge rejected that by saying that even after briefing, the state was unable to identify any instances of voter fraud that would have been stopped by the signature mismatch provision. So I think, to the extent that that's a reason why some opponents of this legislation think that we can't expand absentee voting, that rationale has been rejected by a court because there just isn't the data to support that the signature mismatch provides that kind of election security that people think that it does. So that's all I was going to add to that. And like I said, I previously submitted written testimony. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I have a question. Are there other states that do use that signature mismatch?
There are. I'm sorry, Senator. There are, and there are also a number of other states where lawsuits such as those have been filed. For example, Florida. The ACLU brought one in California that was successful. There was a challenge, I think, in Georgia as well. Ours was, I think, the first, and it sort of set the stage for that. But lawsuits like that are proliferating.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Just as advocates recognize the risk of people's ballots being erroneously rejected, and that's why those cases are being brought.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions for Mr. Klementowicz? Nope. Seeing none. Thank you very much for your testimony. Okay, who's next?
So Liz Tentarelli has also signed up to speak to the amendment.
Great. Welcome, Ms. Tentarelli.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for having me here. I did send written testimony in some detail. I did not have the same draft that you have, so I don't reference page numbers and line numbers, but rather section numbers. So I hope you can follow that. And I don't plan to speak to my written testimony, but rather to address something interesting that I heard just yesterday in the Select Committee 2020 Elections Emergency Support. And that was when Deputy Secretary Scanlon was asked about the language that was going to be used on the Secretary of State's website to explain voting procedures. And we've all been making a pitch that it needs to be clear and simple. And Deputy Secretary Scanlon said that our website explanations stick to statute as much as possible. And I guess I understand that, he doesn't want to simplify to the point of contradicting anything in statute. As president of the League of Women Voters, I sympathize with that point of view because as I try to explain the voting process in very simple handouts and in our website, I do try to simplify it. And I'm always very careful in saying, am I making it too simple? Am I missing some of the nuance that needs to be in there? And when I put in the nuance, it starts getting complicated. For that reason, what I heard from Deputy Secretary Scanlon yesterday, I would suggest that any forms that come out of this amendment or any other bill be stated as simply as possible. As this committee well knows, I have testified before in support of no excuse absentee voting, partly because it simplifies the form. Yeah. And currently the form says that you've got to check off either I'm out of town or I'm disabled. And, I was brought up saying you don't pretend to be disabled. You don't park in a handicapped parking space if you're not disabled. And so it bothers some people, as one of your earlier speakers said, to identify as disabled when we're not. So therefore, if we could pass this no excuse, as many, many other states have, I was playing on the website while this committee was going on, and there are only 15 other states that require an excuse now. We could be moving into the 21st century and the majority by at least doing the no excuse absentee voting, and that would simplify the form so that the typical voter can look at it and say, I get this, I can do this, it's doable. The other point I would like to make is in response to Senator Gray's question about does absentee voting, increased absentee voting, increase turnout? Well, all we have to compare it with is states that do vote by mail, probably. And, you know, there was an interesting town in Utah whose name I can't find, despite playing around here on the website, that was split between two counties. This was in the early days when Utah counties were able to decide either to do vote by mail or expect people to go to the polls or use an excuse absentee. And this was a town that was split demographically almost down the middle in terms of both population and other demographics. And when they did vote by mail, that half of the town shot way up in voter participation and voter turnout. And right now the primary is going on in Nevada, and they're doing vote by mail, and the numbers are way up from last year. Rockville, Maryland, for a municipal election, vote by mail doubled their turnout. Well, we can't double our turnout here in New Hampshire. We're already at 77%, aren't we, in presidential elections? But I would hope that at least on the absentee ballot portion of this, if we go with no excuse absentee, so people don't have to stress over which box to check, that we will increase both the use of the absentee ballot and the participation of voters. And so with that, I will stop talking and hope that you'll read my written testimony. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Tantarelli. Are there any questions? Nope, seeing none. Thank you.
Okay, so next, who signed up to speak is Joseph Bagshaw. However, I know they spoke to the bill. They also signed up to speak to the amendment. I don't see them on our list at this time. So if they're calling in by phone, please feel free to dial *9. And in the meantime, we can move to the next who signed up, which is Olivia Zink.
Hello, Ms. Zink. Welcome again.
Good afternoon again. For the record, my name is Olivia Zink. I live in Franklin and is the Executive Director of Open Democracy. And I really want to just speak to the fact that this crisis has exposed, COVID-19 has exposed many weaknesses in our electoral system. And it's really that urgent that we respond with a comprehensive plan. This emergency has been made worse because we don't have things like an ability to register to vote by mail. And in New Hampshire, we really do have a in-person only. And when clerks are closed, that means people's constitutional right to register to vote is being violated every day that clerks are closed and you have no ability to register to vote. And I think it's really fundamental that we look at where we are right now with the COVID crisis and how can we make as many of the legislative important fixes that are needed in order to make sure that our 2020 elections are safe. And I echo the need for clear and simple guidelines on absentee voting. It is really fundamental that voters understand how to vote by absentee, and our process is not that clear or simple. So anything you can do statutorily to make that clear and simple is really important. Also making sure that our town and city clerks, moderators, supervisors of the checklist are all telling voters the same thing. I began surveying several different town websites, and I will say that many of them don't tell you you can cast an absentee ballot due to COVID. And so I think it's really important that information is available, and most people don't go to the Secretary of State for that website. They go to their local municipal website. I also think allowing voters to submit edible PDF absentee ballot request form with the digital signature is important. I think we need to clarify that you can accept a digital signature. The law says fax, and I don't think anyone owns a fax machine. Not many people own a fax machine anymore. Most people are probably going to scan an email, which is to send that absentee ballot request form. So I think clarifying that is really important, and also ensuring that our absentee systems are racially equitable. Open Democracy has testified prior on registering, creating an online voter registration system. It's a modernization that we support. We supported Senator Gray's bill, as well as the previous legislation cycles on creating an online voter registration system. But I do think, especially in the light of today's guidelines from the Secretary of State, you can only register by mail if you are planning to vote absentee. But I think it's really important that anyone should be able to register to vote. And if in person is the only way and our clerk's offices are closed, that violates people's rights to vote. I will say that I have additional suggestions. On page 3, line 16, I think you should strike the word check 1 on the form for absentee ballot. I think voters should be allowed to check both boxes instead of have to submit 2 pieces of paper with the same information in the light of these elections. If the clerks need forms for both things, then they could be photocopied at the clerk's office. Also on page 6, line 36, I would really recommend that we expand the time. I still see the 1 p.m. time for processing. I have some serious concerns about the need for clerks to have more time to process absentee ballots. And I think striking some of the language allowing 10 voters to petition, all of that should be gone. And maybe this committee should even think about not allowing people to change their mind and vote in person if they've cast an absentee ballot, because again, to simplify the process due to COVID-19. I will say that there's a few things that I do hope this committee does address as it comes to issues in the future, including protecting poll workers, physical social distancing, the poll worker rules. My community changed our polling location on June 1st in my ward, which is the deadline. Many communities, if they wanted to change their poll location, can't, because that deadline of June 1st has passed. We're now less than 100 days from a polling location. So I urge you to look at that. I also think that whatever is done, we need to make sure that all citizens have a robust public information campaign to ensure they know how to register to vote, request an absentee ballot this year, and making sure that we do this in a very clear and simple way. I have a 2-page list of additional suggestions that include making sure that there's an adequate supply of ballots, making sure that an absentee ballot is sent to all registered voter, having simple signups, prepaid postage, a comprehensive ballot tracking, as well as expanding ballot application return options through a secure Dropbox, permitting clerks to send ballots via email, such as what they do for UACAVA voters. Also providing opportunities for voters to cure an error. I think when you're filling out forms to register to vote same day, in front of your supervisors of the checklist, they can say, oh, you forgot to sign, or you forgot to do a certain thing. Where things are being done by mail, I think we need to provide opportunities for voters to cure a document if they forgot to add important piece of information, especially on registering to vote absentee. And I think we really need to sort of think about streamlining some of the processes, including an affidavit request, maybe amending 654-18, which would allow forms to register to vote to be downloaded instead of having to request them. As we think about poll workers in safety, I do think we want to think about possibly adding polling places or consolidating polling places, making sure that we have adequate poll workers and that they are tested and have PPE. And there has been some municipal elections that have done curbside votings and allowing people to vote from their car. And I'd like this committee to begin to think about what changes they could make to RSAs in order to making sure that that this process is simplified, very clear and simple. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Senator Sherman? Yeah.
Hi, Olivia. I think you've been in most of our select committee hearings, and I was just going to ask you if you wouldn't mind making sure that we got a copy of your list of suggested changes. Many of them you mentioned are recommendations coming from the select committee, but it sounds very comprehensive and I'd love to see it.
I did submit it earlier today using the remote submittal of testimony. So
I'll send it over.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that before Senator Birdsall speaks, I just want to add that we are going to be looking at the recommendations made by the committee and put those into a bill. So we will have an opportunity to look through those and see what we can do. Senator Birdsall? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. And thank you for taking my question. Olivia, you sparked my concern when you said not allowing people to vote in person if they have sent in an absentee ballot. What happens if a candidate drops out? Then that person is no longer available to vote. And if he or she would like to come to the polls and choose a candidate of those that are left, I mean, it's happened in presidentials, it's happened in our own local elections. Is that really fair to not give them an option if their candidate has pulled out?
Thank you so much for this question. And I think you're right that we do need to provide that opportunity. I think there's a very small percentage of people who submit an absentee ballot and come in that morning and nullify their absentee ballot and vote in person. It's a very small number of people who exercise that right to change their mind. But I think where COVID-19 provisions are in, we're going to operate in a fact that we're asked to stay home right now. And so voting from home is the safest thing to do. And I think that allowing people to change their mind or giving them that window of not processing absentee ballots till 1 p.m. I know that they can do it 2 hours after polls are opened if properly noticed. But I still think that time is valuable on election day this year. And so this would be a this year only suggestion. And I think many of these COVID-19 changes should be a this year only change to really help promote voting by absentee and ensuring people's safety.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Ms. Zink. Thank you.
All right, next we have signed up to speak is Victoria Turner.
Hello, Ms. Turner. Welcome again.
Thank you. I'll just reintroduce myself briefly. I'm Victoria Turner. I'm a supervisor of the checklist in Bennington, New Hampshire. Have been doing that for about 26 years now. Something else which I've spent a lot of time doing recently is listening in on the Select Committee on Elections. I see a lot of people who have been there have migrated over here. The usual suspects are here. So some of what I'm saying is informed by my experience as a supervisor of the checklist, and some of it is informed by the questions that came up in the Select Committee, some of which I think were adequately addressed and some of which were kind of outside of the purview of the committee, so are better addressed with legislation. But I think what's really come through is that we need to make sure that as many people as possible vote absentee, because we don't know what things are going to look like in the fall as far as COVID-19, and that the systems that we set up now are going to determine whether or not we successfully divert people from voting in person. So the thing that's most important is to take a lot of the laboriousness out of the process, to figure out where the bottlenecks are going to be, and to design systems that are more efficient, that reduce in-person interactions. And some of the processes that we have in place right now are rather complicated and have a number of steps to them. And often the process of having to cure something when somebody doesn't fill out a form correctly adds a whole nother step or two to the process that could potentially push a voter beyond the election and then disenfranchise them. So I'm very much in favor of systems that are efficient. And I think online voter registration is something that we should really consider in the future, for sure. Deputy Scanlon spoke to the fact that he did not think that it was possible to implement online voter registration in the time frame that we have now. However, there are simpler systems that we might be able to deploy that would help people to apply for absentee ballots and apply for absentee registration simply using an online form on the Secretary of State's website. On the voter information lookup page of the Secretary of State's website, there are already 4 ways that you can access ElectionNet to look up your information. And so a process of applying for an absentee ballot or an absentee registration would require that when you type in your information, it accesses ElectionNet and tells you whether you're registered in that town, in the town that you believe you're registered in or not. And what it does is it removes labor from the town clerks. I think that a technology like this would be a lot more simple to deploy than online voter registration. And I think it's something that would help a lot to fix the absentee voter registration system, which is, in my opinion, the system that's the most broken right now. It's really, really hard for people to register absentee, and we need, in this time of COVID-19, to find a better way to do that. I also wanted to address the idea of signatures. The signatures come up in all the application processes. I just signed a document from my daughter's school today using a system called DocuSign, where you can use your own personal signature using a tablet and a stylus. A lot of younger people know how to do this kind of stuff. And so if signatures are the concern, we can still make sure that people do things online and sign them. So the technology's out there and we should look into it. As far as implementing ERIC, the electronic registration information system, I'm not sure quite what the acronym is, I've forgotten it. I just wanted to describe in a little more detail what my process as a supervisor is right now to verify a voter who's moved. If someone has moved within the state and then they register to vote, the next time the supervisors have a session, that person's information comes up automatically. The ElectionNet will tell us on our first screen, it'll say you have 4 voters who have moved out of state. We click on that button and it gives us the names of those voters. We can look at them. We see where they've moved. We click a button and we've approved it. If somebody moves out of state, I'm only required as a supervisor to tell the immediate New England states, that's 5 states surrounding us. And this is a process that the supervisors have to do. The Secretary of State doesn't do it for us. So we have to look up where we have to mail that. We have to make a copy of the information, put it in an envelope, mail it off. It's a time-consuming process. So out of the 51 states and Puerto Rico, maybe it's 52 if you count DC, only 5 of those are required for us to reciprocally tell them that somebody's moved out of state. I also, in 26 years, have never received information from most of the states that people have moved to those states. So basically, we're not being informed when people move. I don't think it's just because people love Bennington, New Hampshire so much that they never move out of the state. Florida, I think, has a law on the books that says that they have to tell us. So I hear from Florida from time to time when people move to Florida. Most states don't tell us at all. So this is something that we're not doing right now, and it's really essential for keeping our checklists up to date. So I think joining ERIC would be a really, really good idea, and it would save a lot of rote work for the supervisors too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Ms. Turner.
You're welcome.
So the next person signed up to speak is Mary Valier Kaplan. However, I don't see them in the attendees list. So if they're calling in, please feel free to dial *9 and that'll virtually raise your hand. Other than that, we just have Tristan Bills and Joseph Bagshaw, again, signed up to speak to the amendment, are no longer on the attendees list. So if they are calling in, please feel free also to dial *9. I don't see any hands raised at this
No
time,
hands
Senator.
raised? Okay.
Oh, Louise Spencer has their hand raised.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Yes,
I,
Ms.
I had
Spencer.
signed up to speak. If I didn't, I apologize. Thank you, Madam Chair, for again taking my testimony. And I'm Louise Spencer. I'm from Concord. I am a member of Kent Street Coalition, but I am here speaking on my own behalf. I just want to point out that we have 2 crises going on in this country right now. One is unfolding in the streets across the nation, but in reality has been with us from the inception of our country. And that's the oppression and violence against Black and Brown people that we cannot allow to continue. We are called on to end it now. Justice delayed is justice denied. The second is the COVID-19 pandemic. Its impact has been devastating in so many ways for so many people, and by all accounts, it is likely to be with us well into the future. Both of these crises demand our attention and demand our response, and voting and elections are central to both. The bill at hand speaks to and addresses the first crisis. It looks to address the sorts of barriers and obstacles to voting that have been far too long, for far too long been both a symbol and a tool of the institutional racism and societal inequities that have kept people from being able to have their voice represented and heard, to fully participate in our democracy. We've long supported the components of this bill, such as no excuse absentee voting and the ability to streamline the processing of the ballots, online voter registration and participation in ERIC as a way to create an electoral system that is free, fair, secure, and as accessible as possible so that all people are able to equally participate in our democracy. We urge the committee to continue the hard work necessary to achieve this critically important objective. We will also need to specifically address the second crisis, COVID-19, and the way it will impact the 2020 elections. Today, the Bipartisan Select Committee on 2020 Emergency Election Support adopted its final report unanimously, making a number of recommendations regarding technical fixes to our current statutory framework. I understand now that there will be a second bill that will seek to codify some of these bipartisan recommendations. The Secretary of State and AG's office have also issued several directives addressing registration and voting for this fall, which may also require some statutory fixes. And these are the sort of short-term COVID specific fixes that most likely should sunset at the conclusion of this election season. But both of these crises speak to the critical importance of legislation, again, that makes it possible for everyone to fully have their voice heard. As you, the committee, do your work here, I think it's important to be really mindful of the fact that voting has always been at the center of the fight for civil liberties and civil rights in this country. And I would hope that this would inform the work that the committee does going forward, given how things are unfolding in our country right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Spencer. Does anyone have questions for Ms. Spencer? Okay, thank you once again for your testimony. And is there anyone else, Ava?
Yes, actually, Deanne Decker has signed up to speak.
Okay, welcome Deanne Decker, Ms. Decker. Nice hat.
Oh, thank you. I have to have my video turned off so that my husband can also run his meeting. Thank you for letting me speak. I am a supervisor of the checklist in the town of Nottingham. We have approximately 4,000 voters. And I wanted to call a couple of things to your attention. One being that I'm in support of the absentee ballots being able to be processed earlier. However, according to RSA 654-28, the checklist does not need to be posted until the Friday before the election. So if you're allowing it to be worked on, things to be done with it on Thursday, it may not in some towns be posted yet. Typically, we wait a little bit later in the cycle that we have, so that other towns have moved people out of our town, so we have a cleaner checklist. And we do have it usually available to the town clerk by Tuesday so that it would work for us, but other towns may not be able to, may not have it available until Friday. Therefore, I think being able to expand Saturday and Sunday for the clerks, I hate people to work on Sundays, but I think in this election cycle, we might all be doing that. And so that is one thing I just wanted to call to your attention. The other is, as far as registering to vote online as a supervisor, of course, that's what we do. My concern is voters that are already registered thinking that they need to re-register. In 2012, we in Nottingham registered 358 voters. About 50 of those were already on our checklist and they thought they had to re-register, and it skewed our numbers until we found everything. So we may end up getting a number of people registering who don't need to. And my other concern with that is having them have to upload documents to prove domicile and citizenship and those kinds of things. Having a contact person at the individual state that they can ask questions of, I think is critical in the registration process. I thank you for all the hard work you guys are doing with this. It's very much, so thank you very much for your hard
Thank you, Madam Chair.
sitting. So I think that might be so that voters
6 days prior to the election, I stay, because I think that would be, or maybe that's fine.
and of how we move forward, educate people on the process. And regarding a online registration system that you already are registered, and show where you're registered. So we can eliminate the issues by educating people and also making sure our systems of states use online registration. Again, I thank you for being a supervisor work. Thank you for testifying. I love your smile. She's like always smiling. Look at her. The picture. It's great. Who else do we have, Ava? Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Victoria Turner has her hand raised. So
Okay. All right, and we're going to be wrapping up soon. I'm hoping. Ms. Turner, welcome again. If we could keep our comments brief, thank you.
Yes, just very brief. I think what I can address what Deanne was talking about. It's not about the last day that we can have our session, but about the day that we post our checklist. And it's always that Friday before the election that we post our checklist. In the case of the supervisors in Bennington, we always just post our checklist on the day that we have our session, because we just don't get that many people coming to register after that. But in a larger town, you would want to make that window a little bit tighter. But I think you could easily fix that in the amendment by just saying that the supervisors have to post their checklist on the Wednesday, at 5 p.m. so that then if you're going to be processing absentee ballots on the Thursday, you have an up-to-date posted checklist there. Does that make sense?
Wow. We might have to get some input from Representative Bergeron, but because we're going to work on this amendment right now. So can I ask you, I'm sorry, to just repeat what you were saying as far as the days? We have Thursday, Friday, and Saturday as a proposal.
For the processing of the absentee ballots. And
Yeah.
I think what Deanne was saying was that you need an updated checklist in order to process those absentee ballots. Now, normally we're required to post our checklist on the Friday after our last session before the election.
Okay.
And so you might have to back up that post date a day or two so that the up-to-date checklist is available for the processing of the absentee ballots.
Okay.
And then anybody who registers to vote after that post date is treated as a same day registration.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak?
no, Senator, there's no one else signed up to speak, and I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Okay, very good. I would like a motion to go into executive session.
Do we need to close the hearing on the?
Oh, I'm sorry. That closes the hearing on HB 1672. Thank you. Thank you.
Move into executive session.
Thank you. Could I have a second? Yes, thank you. Senator Birdsell seconds. We need to take a roll call. So Senator Birdsell?
Aye.
Senator Gray?
Senator Gray, I don't believe you need a roll call to close the public hearing.
I thought I had to have a roll call on all my votes, but.
Yeah, we did a roll call at HHS when we went into exec session.
It's to go into exec session that the roll call is for.
So I don't need a roll.
You do need a roll call.
Yeah,
You
okay.
need a roll call for executive session. I thought you were taking one from what you said to close the public hearing. So,
Oh, no, I
yeah,
closed
to go into
it.
executive session.
So we had a motion from Senator Sherman and a second from Senator Birdsell to go into executive session. And we do need a roll call, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So Senator Sherman.
Yes.
Actually, let me start over again. Senator Birdsell,
Aye.
Senator Gray,
Yes.
Senator Morgan,
Yes.
Senator Sherman,
Yes.
and Senator LeVake, yes. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd like to have a motion on HB 1672, please.
I move HB 1672 ought to pass.
Second.
Thank you. Okay, great. We have a motion and a second.
And I move amendment 1281S ought to pass.
Thank you. In a second.
Second.
Okay, so let's talk about this amendment. It seems like there were some very good suggestions made by Representative Bergeron that we can incorporate, and everybody's got a copy of those changes, those suggestions. The first one was about the election shall occur on a Thursday or Friday, and his suggestion was to add Saturday.
You mean the processing of ballots, not
Processing of ballot, I'm sorry, processing of ballots. And what are your thoughts about that?
It sounds like you're going to need to have, trying to remember what Vicky said, that you will need to have the posting, the checklist posted on Wednesday if you're going to do that.
Yes.
The other way to do it would be to allow them to start as soon as the checklist is posted, but no earlier than Thursday. So if they post it on Friday, then they could start processing on Saturday. But you can't process without it being posted. So you could avoid, in your amendment, in your committee amendment, you could avoid talking about posting. You could put in there that posting would start on Thursday, but no sooner than the checklist is posted, not posting. That processing the ballots can start on Thursday, but no sooner than the checklist is posted. So that would allow Thursday, Friday, or Saturday.
So when we're talking about processing these ballots, is that actually opening, we're opening the first envelope and now we're opening the second envelope for, no?
I don't think so. I think it's opening the first envelope and putting an AV on the checklist.
But you can't actually see the ballot when they're processing. We're not going to open it and see the ballot.
So
it's to prepare it.
Madam Chair, I disagree, but I'm going to look it up in the amendment while you're still talking.
Mm-hmm. Well, are you thinking that they can look at the ballot?
I thought I read that.
No. No. Where is it?
Yeah,
Page number where everyone's looking.
I think it's 7. Let's see, the moderator or his or her designee shall then seal, okay, wait a minute, on the day processed without unfolding the ballot, place it in a container provided by its. I could have sworn I read it.
This sounded great. On page 7, line 26. Okay.
Yeah.
If you look at that, it says right here, it prohibits you from unfolding the ballot. But to prohibit you from unfolding the ballot, you must have opened the inner envelope, and it's in here somewhere. I just got to go find it. And that is one of the objections that I have about this process is opening that inner envelope. And as the one, I believe it was the moderator that testified, that was his objection too. he did not want to open that inter envelope prior to election day.
Yeah, and my understanding is the ballots this year are going to be all 8.5 by 11, which means they're not going to be folded, so it's easier to get into the machine.
That
So-
was, that was our recommendation from the select committee.
Yeah.
So are the ballots going to be folded or not folded?
Folded, but 8.5 by 11. So there
Okay.
won't be any oversized ballots.
So
Okay.
they will be folded. They will not be seen. The content of the ballot will not be seen.
Well, except it's double-sided. So the way they compensate for long ballots is they will do double-sided ballots for some of the towns that need more space.
Mhm. Okay.
Madam Chair, this is Senator Gray again.
Yes, Senator
I
Gray.
believe what happens in the folding is that you get 2 creases instead of 3 creases, okay, because of the long ballot. And that will make some bit of difference with the 8.5 by 11 and how tall the ballots that are in the ballot box after being put through the machine make that residual pile.
So, Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
So
Senator.
we've heard a lot of testimony about processing ballots early, and I think we were fairly vague in our recommendations on this. It was fairly unanimous, where it was a consensus that it would be great to process before election day if you could. If you separate the ballot from the inner envelope, you end up making it impossible to allow people to come back and change their vote. As long as the ballot is attached to the outer envelope, so you know who cast that ballot, you could potentially have the option in those first 2 hours of allowing somebody to change their vote, because you'd know that that ballot belonged to that person. So those were the 2 algorithms moving forward. One was to say, no, we separate them, and then once you've voted absentee, you're done. And the other one was to say, no, we keep them together. And once you voted absentee and you come in within that 2-hour window and say, I want to change my vote, then they can go in, the supervisor can go in and pull that ballot because it's still attached to the envelope. And you would still have that option. So those were the 2 coming out of the select committee that were available.
Thank you for that input, Senator Sherman. I just want to make a note about the posting the checklist no earlier than Thursday. And as I looked through this, I didn't see reference about posting the checklist.
No, there's nothing in the bill on posting the checklist. And that was the point. So you have 2 options. One, you can't start processing absentee ballots until after the checklist is posted.
Yeah.
Or you say you have to post the checklist on Wednesday, by Wednesday, so that they can start according to this amendment.
Okay, so let's add some verbiage that will cover us for posting the checklist.
So my recommendation would be not to get involved in telling them when they can post the checklist, but telling them that they can't start processing absentee ballots until the checklist says posted. So if the supervisor of the checklist says, okay, well, we want to be able to start on Thursday because we're going to have such a high volume of absentee ballots, it would behoove them to post on Wednesday. So we're not telling them they have to do it Wednesday, but if they wait till Friday to post it, then they only have that Saturday to do early processing. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
So you want some wording?
Yeah, well, you just said the supervisor of the checklist cannot process.
Well, you have the phrase, the partial, let me find his amendment. It's on line 14 and 15, page 8 of the amendment, which is in section 12. So if you say, currently it reads in the amendment to the amendment, the partial processing of absentee ballots prior to an election shall occur on the Thursday, Friday, or Saturday prior to the date of the election. I would say may occur. I'm not sure why it's shall. I would say may occur on the Thursday, Friday, or Saturday prior to the date of the election, but only after the checklist has been posted. Or you could say the partial processing of absentee ballots prior to an election shall occur after the checklist has been posted on the Thursday, Friday, or Saturday prior to the date of the election. That's probably a little cleaner.
Tricia, are you voraciously writing?
Yes.
Okay. And I think it says shall, a copy of the notice shall be provided to, oh, I'm sorry.
No, this is the.
Yeah, the partial processing of an absentee ballot prior to the election shall occur. So we're giving them like 3 choices of when it will occur.
Is that you're not giving them the choice if they feel like they can do the whole thing and on the day of the election, like Dixville Notch. Why do they have to do it 4 or 5 days beforehand? Why isn't it left to the, would that be left to the supervisor or the moderator? So shouldn't it be may rather than shall in that sentence, the partial processing of absentee ballots prior to an election after the checklist has been posted may occur on the Thursday, Friday, or permissive, not prescriptive.
So I think that we need to look at the beginning of the section on line 8. And it says the moderator or his or her designee may begin the processing of absentee ballots prior to the opening of the polls. So that's where they get their, they may or they may not. So Dixville Notch, they don't have to do any pre-processing because they can do it all in one day. However, if you choose to do the pre-processing, then it shall occur in this window.
Well, then you have to say if you choose to.
Well, it says that at the beginning. They may begin the process of absentee ballots. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that?
Madam Chair, Senator Gray.
Yes, Senator Gray.
I have a comment on the whole process that we're using.
Yes.
Since all of this is combined into one bill, and there are things in here that I absolutely cannot support, such as the ERIC portion of it and some other portions of it. It makes little sense for me to argue over points in this unless there is the possibility of getting portions of this bill into a bill that I can support. And I'd be happy to help work towards that, like the processing of these ballots, as long as the inner envelope isn't opened until after the rules prescribed in 659, 49, and 49A. So again, I'm going to sit here and be quiet as long as this is all part of another thing. I certainly do not agree with those parts of the bill, but it's only going to prolong your meeting here if I go and try to interject to make some of those things more palatable to myself because of the poison pills that are left in the bill otherwise.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Gray. I understand how you feel. It is a poison pill. I understand that you don't support this. This is all the pieces that are in this amendment are things that that I do support, and many of us do support. So I understand if you don't want to belabor it with input that's not going to move us anywhere. So that's not a problem. But I would like to make this look a little bit tighter before we vote on it. We will be voting. So can Alan?
Here, this Senator Gray.
Yes, Senator Gray.
Again, it is not that I do not support any portions of this bill.
I understand.
Pre-processing of ballots and some of the other items that are in there, I can support. But
Okay.
for them to be voted, I get one vote on this whole bill.
Right.
Okay? And if the chair, in her wisdom, wants to take some of those other bills that we're doing away with and take out some of these things that can be supported in a bipartisan way, I'd be more than happy to work with the chair on getting those things in a separate bill that I can support.
Thank you very much, Senator Gray.
So,
Gotcha.
Madam
Yes.
Chair, I think we're almost there with this. If you've got that first sentence in lines 8 through 10, at the end of that sentence, then it starts, such notice. What if you just had a phrase before that? They may begin the processing, something that says, if the moderator chooses to do so, comma, such notice, and then the rest of this paragraph, all of it could be shall. It just, to me, it's not, unless in the context of that first sentence, you're correct that it's may, but to me, it'd be a little clearer that everything, all those shalls are only applying to the decision, yes, we're going to do this early.
Okay, so I agree with that. Why don't you give us the verbiage, please?
It's line 10, before the word such, after the period, processing period.
Yeah.
If the moderator chooses to do so, comma, such notice shall be posted. And then we would follow Representative Bergeron's amendment. And in that amendment, again, using that amendment, again, before such notice, it has to say if the moderator chooses to do so. And then the only other change would be the partial processing of absentee ballots prior to an election shall occur after the checklist is posted on the Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. Those are the only two changes that I see to make this workable and respond to what Vicky and everybody was saying.
Okay. Tricia, do you have that?
Yes, and can I repeat it so that we can?
Please.
So Senator Sherman, when you gave the first about on line 10 before such, were you on the amendment?
Yes.
Our
This
amendment, correct?
is all on, yes.
And
It's
then,
actually, it can also be on his because the wording is still in there on his, but
Okay.
it's on page number 2 toward the bottom.
oh, okay, great, thank you. And then it says, so it's before the word such, correct?
Yeah, after processing period, before the word such,
If the moderator chooses to do so,
comma,
comma, and then,
such.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the one about the partial processing of absentee ballots prior to an election shall occur after the checklist is posted on Thursday.
Actually, you should say after posting of the checklist.
Okay.
And well, hold it because the syntax is messed up.
Mhm.
Prior to an election shall occur. You could say on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday.
Okay.
Prior to the date of the election after posting of the checklist.
Okay.
That's the way it has to be. Otherwise, you're putting Thursday, Friday, or Saturday in with posting of the
Right.
checklist. And you don't
Right.
want to.
Shall occur
On the Thursday, Friday, or Saturday prior to the date of the election after posting of the checklist.
mhm. After the posting, okay.
Are you good with that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I think that reads well.
You need a motion to accept this as a committee amendment?
We're not done.
Okay.
We have 3 suggestions that were made by Representative Bergeron, and 1 suggestion that came out of our conversation with Deputy Scanlon. So, okay, so the next one is, let's see. In Senator Bergeron's handout, it's highlighted in red. Representatives of each of the 2 parties which received the largest number of votes cast for governor at the last previous general election shall assist during this process, but neither party shall exceed the other party's representation by more than 1 participant. Any number of election officials who are registered as undeclared voters may be appointed by the moderator to assist in this process. So that is their second one, and it replaces where it says no more than 2. Yeah, no more than 2 of whom shall be members of the same party. And that is. Okay, and that's on line 16. So I think that this is a good amendment. It makes it a little bit more clear that it's not just 3 people.
So that whole section in red
Yeah.
is what you're suggesting for the
Right.
number 2 change on the amendment?
Yes.
Okay.
Do we have any feedback on that?
I think we should just go ahead and incorporate it.
Okay. All right, so let's go on. I mean, if anybody else wants to speak up, please speak up. So the next suggestion by Representative Bergeron was, it's highlighted in red. Just trying to find it. Oh, line 25 on page 8.
About the polling location?
If it is not practicable to partially process absentee ballots at the polling location, the clerk shall provide notice in accordance with RSA 659-55-A. 1, that the partial processing of absentee ballots will occur at Town Hall, City Hall, or some other location within the municipality. I think that's a really good suggestion because the schools might not be available to do that, open to do that pre-processing.
The public notice is already given though, correct? Or did we have to have a second sentence that talks about public notice?
Yeah, it is, but this is basically, well, the clerk shall provide notice. Important because they're changing the location.
How about just say clerk shall provide location. No, it's right. Okay. All right. I have a 4 o'clock, so I'm
Okay.
hoping we can wrap
All
it up.
right, well, let's do one last thing that we got to do. So the last change that I wanted to make was on page 9, line 20, talking about online voter registration, and say beginning January 2021. So that way, Secretary of State does not have to worry about this at all during this election. So again, that's page 9, line 20.
On the original amendment?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so I move this as a committee amendment with those changes. John?
I was muted, sir. Second.
Okay.
There, Senator Morgan.
So, so now we're going to take a vote on the
Committee amendment.
committee amendment. And we'll take a roll call vote. Senator Birdsell,
No.
Senator Gray,
No.
Senator Morgan,
Yes.
Senator Sherman,
Yes.
Senator LeBake, yes.
I move the amendment as amended. Actually, we already have that as.
Yeah. We need the bill as amended, right?
Yeah, I think we need to vote on the whole amendment first, right?
No.
With the bill as OTPA?
Yes. Right, Jenny? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's where we are, or do we need?
That's where we are. We need a motion to move it OTPA.
Oh, we already have that.
We already have that. We just need to vote.
Yeah.
We started out
Okay.
with an OTP.
Yeah, and then
Okay.
you just approved the amendment, so now we're voting on OTPA.
Okay, so,
Has anybody
All right.
seconded it?
yeah, has it been?
Morgan.
Yeah.
Yes,
Mm.
Morgan. Senator,
Okay,
sorry,
I'm
Senator
sorry,
Morgan.
you're kind of, all right, and we had a second? Yes,
Yes.
all right. Let's take a roll call. Senator Birdsell,
No.
Senator Gray,
No.
Senator Morgan,
Yes.
Senator Sherman,
Yes.
Senator LeBake, yes. Thank you all very much, and I will be taking that bill out.
I move we come out of executive session.
Second.
All those in favor? Do I have to do a roll call for that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Senator Birdsell,
Aye.
Senator Gray,
Yes.
Senator Morgan,
Yes.
Senator Sherman,
I'm proud that there are some things unanimous here. Yes.
and Senator LeBake, yes. Wonderful. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time.
You bet.
Off
Thank
to your next meeting.
Aye.
Okay, bye. Bye, thanks.
We're still,
You did great.
is it still live on YouTube, it says?